Beneath the crowns, behind the portraits, under layers of lace and powdered dignity, something was festering. For centuries, Britain's royal bloodline carried more than just entitlement and scandal. It carried rumors of a disease no one dared name in public, whispers of secret treatments, hidden doctors, blue pills and mercury. This isn't a medical history, it's a royal autopsy. Because behind every throne, there's a body, and some of them were rotting from the inside out. Welcome to 20 British royals who suffered from syphilis, a tale of kings, queens, and the disease that wouldn't bow. Before we dive in, if you like your history dark, ironic, and just a little bit diseased, go ahead and subscribe. It helps keep this channel alive, unlike half the royals in this story. Also, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Toronto? Let's see who else couldn't sleep. 1. Edward IV, 1442 to 1483. It's hard to picture the founder of the House of York as anything but victorious. Towering at over 6 feet tall, broad, golden-haired, and battlefield-built, Edward IV was what the medieval PR machine would have called a certified war god. But beneath the armor and royal velvet, something in his blood may have been rotting him from the inside out. By the time Edward reached his early 40s, the glint had dulled. Chroniclers wrote of a sudden, ugly decline. Boils, fevers, chronic fatigue, and what one account politely called a visitation of pustules. The king who once charged into battles without a helmet was now reportedly too ill to climb stairs. In an era when medical diagnoses were more poetic metaphor than science, one disease lingered behind the curtain like a court whisper, the great pox, syphilis. Though never officially recorded, Edward's symptoms read like a Renaissance checklist for it. And the timing tracks. The French disease was already tearing through Europe's nobility by the 1490s. Edward's reign landing squarely in its path. Some historians argue his early death was just the accumulated stress of warfare. Others raise an eyebrow at how quickly he withered once removed from the battlefield. The decay didn't stop at him either. His children, Edward V and the lost princes in the Tower, would vanish into infamy just years later. But if Edward was the glamorous face of a crumbling monarchy, the next king, the cold and calculating one, might have inherited more than just the throne. 2. Henry VII, 1457 to 1509. Henry VII was not a man of romance. He smiled rarely, trusted few, and counted his pennies like they might stage a rebellion. In the official portraits, he looks like a man permanently bracing for something, probably because he was. After all, his entire reign was built on anxiety. One usurped throne, one suspicious marriage, and a country still coughing up blood from the Wars of the Roses. So when whispers surfaced that Henry may have been infected with the French disease later in life, it felt like one more crack in the austere mask he wore so tightly. The evidence is circumstantial, of course, like all rumors that cling to dead kings, but intriguing. There were outbreaks at court. There were reports of the king suffering intermittent fevers, joint pain, and mysterious skin lesions. There were sudden orders for court physicians to keep treatments quiet. The phrase, the pox, was tossed around just enough to raise suspicions, then buried again beneath tutored discretion. What makes it compelling isn't how scandalous it is, but how ordinary. If the most careful king of the era, frugal, pious, politically robotic, still might have contracted a disease of indulgence, it says more about the world than the man. Nobody was untouchable, not even the king who built a dynasty on caution. But if Henry VII kept his demons buried, his son, Henry VIII, dragged them out in full gold-plated theatrical flair, and possibly infected glory. 2 kings down, 18 to go, and we're just getting to the fever dreams. If you're enjoying this strange royal descent, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next unsettling deep dive. And while you're here, tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from and what time is it? Are you in bed, on a night shift, or just casually learning about royal infections at breakfast? Let's make this weird little corner of the internet feel a bit less lonely. 3. Henry VIII, 1491 to 1547. Here's the thing about Henry VIII. He was the royal equivalent of a wrecking ball made of steak and paranoia. 6 marriages, hundreds of executions, and enough religious rebranding to make even Martin Luther wince. Henry didn't just break with the Catholic Church, he dislocated the neck of an entire era. And through it all, an awkward rumor clung to his heels like a limping ghost, that the king himself was riddled with syphilis. It's a seductive theory. The ulcers, the chronic migraines, the infamous jousting accident that left him with leg wounds which never healed, the weight gain, the mood swings, the rotting teeth, and, most tantalizingly, the tragic failures to produce a healthy male heir. Add in his infamous temper and episodes of irrational cruelty, and you have a medical checklist begging for a diagnosis. Except, it doesn't quite hold. Modern historians are skeptical. There's no concrete evidence of mercury treatments, no documented physicians prescribing the usual syphilis cures. Some argue that the king's ailments stemmed more from diabetes, Cushing's disease, or simply the result of years of reckless living and untreated injuries. But the myth persists, because it fits the character. A king so determined to bend fate that he might have also been slowly eroding from within. And if Henry VIII wasn't the poxed patriarch everyone imagined, maybe his unlucky son, the one who died young and mysteriously, was. 4. Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, 1519 to 1536. Henry Fitzroy was born on the wrong side of the sheets, but the right side of ambition. As the illegitimate son of Henry VIII and his teenage mistress Elizabeth Blount, Fitzroy was gifted titles, palaces, and the kind of fast-track grooming that suggested his father might have been considering a royal loophole. He was barely 6 when he became Duke of Richmond. By 17 he was dead. The official story was tuberculosis. It always is, with young noble deaths that come too quickly to explain. But contemporary accounts murmur something darker, phrases like, the wasting disease and his father's affliction. To those with creative hindsight and a fondness for diagnosis. By metaphor, Fitzroy's early death was chalked up to congenital syphilis. After all, the rumors about Henry VIII's own health were already circulating. It would have made sense. But here's the thing. Congenital syphilis leaves marks. Bone deformities, facial scarring. There's no evidence Fitzroy had any of them. His education was robust. His appearance, by all records, was noble and unblemished. Still, his rapid collapse, described as a sudden draining away of vitality, fueled a mythology that refuses to die. Maybe he was simply a pawn in an empire built on failing bloodlines. Or maybe he inherited more than just his father's name. But if Fitzroy was a footnote in a sickly royal saga, the next queen turned suffering into spectacle and carried ghosts in her womb. 5. Mary, Eye of England, 1516 to 1558. Mary Tudor ruled with a Bible in one hand and a funeral bell in the other. She was England's first official queen regnant, and also its most haunted. Her reign is remembered for burning Protestants, but her legacy? It smolders around her belly. 2 phantom pregnancies, no living heir, a lifetime of pain that no physician could name and no historian has ever fully explained, which is where the syphilis theory creeps in, awkwardly and often. Some 19th century historians, eager for answers, suggested that Mary suffered from congenital syphilis, passed down perhaps from her father, or through some shadowy affliction inherited from earlier Tudors. The evidence? Murky. Her menstruation was irregular. She was plagued by headaches and insomnia. Her skin was described in letters as sallow and tender. And those 2 false pregnancies, complete with growing bellies and royal announcements, only deepened the mystery. But most modern scholars attribute her health problems to psychosomatic stress, hormonal disorders, or possibly uterine cancer. Still, the idea that she was doomed before she ever ruled, that the crown passed not just through blood, but through illness, has stuck. Because Mary wasn't just a tragic queen. She was a living contradiction, devout, cursed, crowned, and childless. And if she was England's most tormented monarch, the next king ruled through his own shaking, ulcerated fog. 6. James VI and I, 1566 to 1625, James VI of Scotland, who later became James I of England, unified the crowns but never quite earned the adoration of either kingdom. He was a king of contradictions, highly educated yet oddly credulous, devout yet obsessed with witchcraft, powerful yet constantly plagued by what he called his infirmities. And it's those infirmities that sparked a quiet, lingering theory. Was James suffering from syphilis? He had all the courtly ingredients for it: chronic tremors, facial twitching, ulcerations described by contemporary doctors as moist and foul, a preference for heavy perfume. And then there was the mercury, prescribed to James multiple times by his royal physicians. At the time, mercury was the go-to cure for the great pox, despite the inconvenient fact that it slowly poisoned people. James reportedly bathed in it, drank it, and sweated under layers of wool after dosing himself. His personal hygiene was famously terrible, and he frequently isolated himself, citing vapors and melancholy. Gossip at court danced carefully around his health, never accusing, just insinuating. Officially, he died of a stroke, but unofficially, his slow decline, erratic behavior, and dependence on mercury hint at something deeper and more shameful by the standards of the day. And yet, if James brought the English court into a new political era, the king after him brought back something older: decadence, debauchery, and possibly a touch of royal rot. 7. Charles II, 1630–1685. They didn't call Charles II the merry monarch because he was well-behaved. He returned to the English throne in a blaze of libertine glory. After years in exile, he brought back theater, fashion, loose morals, and a royal court that operated more like a masquerade ball. Charles had over a dozen mistresses, at least a dozen illegitimate children, and an appetite for vice that left little room for discretion. So when rumors surfaced that he'd contracted syphilis as a young man in exile, probably in France, no one blinked. His own physicians dosed him with guaiacum, the holy wood commonly used to treat the pox, and prescribed mercury-based concoctions under the typical euphemism of nervous disorders. He suffered from chronic skin lesions, fatigue, and a sudden downturn in health in his final years. His autopsy revealed blackened lungs, enlarged organs, and strange bodily decay, an open-ended medical report wrapped in royal vagueness. But what makes Charles a fascinating study isn't just the likelihood he had syphilis. It's that it never slowed him down. If anything, he partied through it. He died surrounded by candles, courtiers, and conflicting medical treatments. One of his final requests? Let not poor Nellie starve, referring to his mistress Nell Gwynn, a king to the end, and possibly a poxed one. And then came George, a prince who preferred gouty breakfasts to governance, and may have carried more than just political baggage into the 19th century. 8. George IV, 1762 to 1830. If excess could be distilled into a single human, it would probably look like George IV. By the time he took the throne, he was already infamous for ballooning debts, scandalous affairs, and a wardrobe so elaborate it required its own economy. But beneath the satin waistcoats and powdered wigs, there may have been something far less fashionable at work, an infection that outlasted the gossip columns. His medical records are a minefield of euphemism. Blue pills were prescribed in cycles. These were mercury-based treatments, routinely used to treat syphilis. He also took guaiacum and other anti-venereal remedies throughout his adult life. While publicly treated for gout and dropsy privately, physicians were dealing with something messier. Letters mention swellings, eruptions, and an unnamed condition that worsened with age. George himself made jokes about being eaten alive from within, though whether he was being literal or flamboyantly morbid is unclear. Despite his reputation for excess, George's body paid a very specific price. By the end, he could barely walk, ballooned with fluid, and reportedly suffered from hallucinations. His final years were a slow collapse, hidden behind velvet curtains and royal etiquette. But even George had someone to blame. His younger brother, less king, more cautionary tale, had his own secrets and a mistress who wasn't afraid to talk. 9. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, 1763 to 1827. Prince Frederick was the military-minded second son, better known for losing wars than winning hearts. Appointed commander-in-chief of the British Army, he modernized recruitment, cracked down on corruption, and unintentionally became the face of a nursery rhyme, the Grand Old Duke of York. Behind the scenes, however, Frederick may have been waging a far more personal battle, one that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with venereal disease. The rumors began with Mary Ann Clark, his highly publicized mistress. After their relationship soured, she told newspapers and Parliament that the Duke was unwell in his privates and required repeated doses of mercury and blue pills. Her words were dismissed as revenge-fueled drama, but the implications lingered. The press hinted at a disease of Venus, a popular euphemism for syphilis, and noted his sudden disappearances from public view for extended treatments. Frederick never denied it. He just kept quiet, as royals tended to do when their ailments became more metaphor than diagnosis. His final years were defined by increasing isolation, poor health, and quiet withdrawal from court life. But not all royal illnesses could be hidden behind palace walls. Some, like the next princes, came with a public funeral and a mystery diagnosis that's still debated to this day. 10. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, 1864 to 1892. Prince Albert Victor was born into the cold machinery of Victorian royalty, a future king shaped by expectations and silences. But even before he could properly bungle the throne, he was dead. At 28, after what the papers called a sudden illness, Albert Victor vanished from history, leaving behind a coffin, a crown-shaped void, and a lot of questions. Chief among them, was it really influenza and pneumonia that killed him, or something more taboo? The rumors began almost immediately. Some said it was typhoid, others said tuberculosis. But one theory that has trailed his name like a persistent shadow is syphilis. Specifically, tertiary syphilis, the final, most destructive stage of the disease. It would have explained the erratic behavior, the mysterious retreats for health, and the unusually vague language used in his death notices. Biographers have pointed to the secrecy surrounding his medical records and the euphemistic tone of royal communications. No definitive diagnosis has ever emerged. What's especially eerie is that Albert Victor was once falsely linked to the Jack the Ripper case, suggesting not just illness, but depravity. Though thoroughly debunked, the story stuck. Like many Victorian myths, it had just enough elegance and decay to feel true. And if Albert Victor's illness was cloaked in ambiguity, the next royal woman was accused in broad daylight, her enemies dragging her name through mud and makeup. 11. Elizabeth Wurst, 1533 to 1603. By the time Elizabeth I reached middle age, her face had become a national artifact. Painted porcelain white with layers of lead-laced cosmetics, her visage was as much a weapon as a mask. It was said to conceal scars, both literal and symbolic, and that's where the syphilis rumors began. They weren't medical so much as political. In Elizabeth's time, being a powerful unmarried woman was itself a scandal. Accusing her of venereal disease? Just another page in the playbook. Enemies, foreign and domestic, whispered that the Queen's hair loss, thinning body, and overly powdered face weren't just vanity, but camouflage for the pox. Of course, historians now agree that smallpox left the scars, and lead in the cosmetics likely did the rest of the damage. Still, The gossip didn't stop. Protestants called her virgin. Catholics called her tainted. Her refusal to marry made her the subject of both religious propaganda and bedroom rumors. In truth, Elizabeth's real affliction may have been political loneliness, surrounded by courtiers, yet constantly dodging alliances disguised as proposals. But in a world where women couldn't rule without becoming legends or monsters, Elizabeth managed to become both. And while her throne was built on image and intellect, her successor's body would betray him in far less elegant ways. 12. Charles I, 1600 through 1649. Charles there wasn't just a king, he was a slow-moving contradiction in a velvet doublet. Raised to believe in divine right, obsessed with ritual, and deeply introverted, Charles ruled like he was composing a tragic opera. And he got the ending to match. Beheaded in front of a crowd, sanctified by royalists, vilified by Parliament. But before the sword fell, something else may have been eating away at him, if 17th century rumor mills are to be believed. Portraits of Charles from the latter years of his reign show blotchy skin, brittle hair, and hollow cheeks. Court gossip spoke of eruptive fevers and mysterious purifications administered by royal physicians. Of course, none of it was definitive. Most of these insinuations came from his enemies, pamphleteers and satirists who would have accused him of anything if it stuck. And syphilis? That was a favorite slur for fallen kings, implying moral rot with physical decay. Still, the records show visits from physicians who specialized in venereal treatments, purchases of mercury-based tonics, and long absences from court due to unnamed illnesses. It could have been nothing, or it could have been the slow unraveling of a man destined to fall apart publicly. Yet Charles died with composure. His son, however, would live long enough to earn the nickname the Catholic Poxed Prince behind his back, and the suspicions weren't entirely political. 13. James II, 1633 to 1701. James II never had the polish of his older brother Charles II. Where Charles was charming and theatrical, James was stiff, devout, and chronically unlucky. His conversion to Catholicism triggered a full-blown constitutional crisis. His reign collapsed in the Glorious Revolution, and even before that, the whispers had started about his youth, his affairs, and a disease he may have carried into old age like a royal heirloom. Several pamphlets of the time accused James of having been poxed during his wilder younger years. While these were politically motivated, a Protestant dig at a Catholic monarch, they weren't entirely baseless. James had mistresses. He spent years as a soldier abroad, particularly in France and Spain, where syphilis was not uncommon among military men, and his health was unreliable, plagued by fevers, rashes, and sudden spells of weakness. Medical records are limited, but there are accounts of treatments typical for venereal conditions, including purgatives and mercury applications. He lived longer than most expected, but he never quite escaped the air of decay, physical or political. Even in exile, the stories followed him. And if James's case was always a matter of suspicion, his grandson would leave behind ledgers, actual bills, for doctors whose cures didn't come cheap or clean. 14. George II, 1683-1760. George II is remembered, if at all, as the last British king to personally lead troops into battle. But he also might hold another, quieter distinction, one not engraved on statues or taught in classrooms. His household records, when not busy cataloging the royal wine cellar, include discreet purchases from physicians known for treating venereal disease. Mercury in various forms pops up, as do notes for blue pills and anonymous elixirs for purification. Officially, there's no declaration of illness. George II was never publicly diagnosed with anything more embarrassing than indigestion. But behind the tightly corseted language of 18th century record-keeping, there's enough smoke to make people wonder. One bill even specified treatment for eruptions of heat and swelling in the limbs. vague enough to mean anything, and suspicious enough to raise eyebrows. He was not known for promiscuity, but he did spend long stretches away from his queen, and gossip hinted at occasional liaisons. Still, in a court saturated with secrets, nothing was ever proven. Perhaps he was just paying for someone else's medication. Or perhaps, like so many royals before him, he was quietly managing a disease that didn't ask for royal permission before taking root. And if George II was only a footnote in the ledger of venereal suspicion, his nephew made sure to write his own chapter, with scandal, scandalous love, and a long illness no one wanted to name. 15. Prince Henry, Duke of Cumberland, 1745 to 1790. Prince Henry, Duke of Cumberland, was the kind of royal who made palace staff mutter under their breath. His life was a carousel of gambling debts, forbidden marriages, and theatrical improprieties. He famously married Anne Horton, a commoner and former mistress, sparking outrage so severe it helped prompt the Royal Marriages Act of 1772. But it wasn't just his romantic decisions that caused concern. It was what happened to him after. Henry reportedly suffered a prolonged illness in his later years. Court diarists, with their usual passive-aggressive flair, described it as of a secret nature. He became increasingly reclusive, underwent multiple treatments involving purgatives and mystery tonics, and was subject to a number of unflattering insinuations from political commentators who used words like tainted and fallen. The public, already suspicious of his personal life, filled in the blanks. There were no formal accusations, but the hints were there, pointing to syphilis as the likely culprit of his decline. It fit the pattern: years of excess, followed by a mysteriously long and uncomfortable end. His marriage, viewed by some as morally suspect, was now framed as physically suspect too. And if Prince Henry's sins were whispered behind closed doors, the next royal couple made it all the way into the tabloids, where both sides of the broken marriage were accused of bringing more than just heartbreak to the bedroom. 16. Queen Caroline of Brunswick, 1768 to 1821. Queen Caroline of Brunswick didn't just marry into dysfunction, she practically wrestled it to the floor. Her union with George IV was a royal farce from the start. He detested her before the ink dried on their marriage certificate. She returned the favor with equal theatricality. Their separation was swift, but the fallout dragged on for decades, transforming into one of the most bitter, public, and medically speculative royal feuds in British history. During their estrangement, satirical cartoons and pamphlets had a field day. Caroline was lampooned for everything from her weight to her accent, but among the cruelest jabs were accusations that both she and George IV were poxed, a Victorian shorthand for syphilitic. One cartoon depicted them as diseased grotesques, blaming each other for their physical decline, with a caption so venomous it barely passed censors. No medical record confirms she ever had the illness, but the accusation alone was enough to shape public perception. Ironically, public sympathy shifted toward her. While George hid behind curtains and court physicians, Caroline marched into the House of Lords during her adultery trial, demanding justice with tabloid flair. The illness, real or not, became part of the myth. She died just weeks after being denied entry to George's coronation. And if Caroline's alleged affliction was political theater, her royal nephew's was whispered with concern and carried the scent of post-mortem speculation. 17. Edward VII, 1841 to 1910. Edward VII lived in the long shadow of his mother, Queen Victoria, and seemed determined to compensate for it by filling every possible room with charm, smoke, and expensive perfume. Before he became king, he was Europe's most infamous playboy prince, a man whose mistresses had mistresses. So it's perhaps inevitable that rumors of syphilis attach themselves to him like another silk waistcoat. Valets, discreet memoirists, and the occasional court whisper all suggest he was familiar with prophylactic ointments and under-the-table remedies. His valet allegedly prepared personal salves before certain social visits, enough to raise eyebrows but never confirm anything. If Edward had syphilis, he either recovered or managed it well enough to keep it off the books. He lived to 70, long enough to outlast scandal and reign with surprising competence. Yet, in the years after his death, speculative biographies emerged with hushed references to past indiscretions and lingering consequences. The Edwardian court, so polished on the surface, was filled with physicians whose ledgers told a different story, one of quiet treatments and euphemistic prescriptions. And if Edward VII's illness was never proven, the next prince on the list had a file thick enough to attract attention from more than just doctors. MI5 took notes too. 18. Prince George, Duke of Kent, 1902 to 1942. Prince George, Duke of Kent, was the royal who seemed determined to live like a tabloid headline. Handsome, magnetic, and often elusive, he was less interested in the duties of monarchy and more drawn to the glittering edge of 1930s aristocratic nightlife. Fast cars, fast friendships, and fast exits. But along with the glamour came the murmurs, persistent if shadowy, of addiction, affairs, and something more sinister. Whispers of syphilis. Unlike the older generations, George's life unfolded in the age of mass media. The British press, while still deferential to the crown, couldn't fully contain the rumors. Gossip columns, both foreign and domestic, hinted at medical treatments and long absences disguised as travel or exhaustion. Confidential notes from intelligence services, now partially declassified, contained veiled references to medical complications and private matters that required regular monitoring. It's hard to separate fact from sensationalism. Some allege he contracted an illness during his wilder years in the 1920s, when he moved through high society circles that weren't exactly scandal-proof. Others argue these rumors were politically motivated, designed to curtail his influence or discredit his unconventional lifestyle. He died young, in a plane crash during World War II. Officially, it was a tragic accident. Unofficially, his entire life feels like a royal dossier left conveniently incomplete. But if George's secrets were buried with him, the next royal figure had his reputation questioned while still in mourning, his fever mistaken, by some, for something far more controversial. 19. Prince Albert, 1819 to 1861. Prince Albert was everything Queen Victoria wasn't: precise, measured, and deeply committed to the modernization of the monarchy. He introduced plumbing to palaces, pushed for reform, and practically micromanaged the moral tone of the 19th century court. So naturally, Victorian society rewarded him with an unfounded rumor that he had died, not of typhoid as reported, but of syphilis. It began with timing. Albert's final illness came quickly. He grew feverish, lethargic, and weakened in a matter of weeks. Although the official diagnosis was typhoid fever, some of his symptoms, mental confusion, muscle weakness, and prolonged exhaustion, didn't quite match the typical profile. That was all some needed to launch alternative theories. Whispers claimed he had contracted a venereal disease earlier in life, perhaps during his youth in Germany, or more scandalously, during his time in England. There was no evidence. Not a single document or physician's note confirmed it. But the rumor gained traction in the decades that followed, mostly because it felt like a contradiction too delicious to ignore. The paragon of propriety brought down by a disease associated with vice. Albert died young and overworked, the moral compass of an empire that couldn't save him. And then came his great-grandson, another royal with a throne in reach, a reputation on edge, and rumors that refused to stay buried. 20. Edward VIII, Duke of Windsor, 1894 to 1972. Edward VIII's reign lasted just 11 months, but the rumors have lasted a lifetime. Abdicating the throne for love, he became the romantic cautionary tale of the 20th century. But beyond the speeches, scandals, and exiled elegance, there were whispers, filed quietly away in the darker drawers of British intelligence. According to some mid-century chatter, Edward may have left behind more than just a crown. Some claimed he left behind a venereal infection too. The theory hinges on his bachelor years, when Edward, then Prince of Wales, was infamous for his whirlwind affairs, nightclub escapades, and general disregard for the expectations of a future king. MI5 files from the era, now partially unsealed, hint at medical concerns cloaked in euphemism. Sudden overseas rest cures, discreet visits to private physicians, and suspicions of an affliction of improper origin. Whether this points to syphilis or merely anxiety dressed in code is still debated. Publicly, no diagnosis was ever made. He remained dapper, athletic, and politically evasive. But his reputation suffered its own slow erosion, from national hero to diplomatic liability. His ties to questionable figures in wartime Europe did little to help. In the end, Edward VIII's greatest disease may have been disconnection, from duty, from country, and perhaps even from truth. Which leaves us here, after 20 royals, 20 half-truths, and a royal lineage shadowed by one peculiar, persistent affliction. Some left behind only whispers. Others left ledgers, symptoms, or suspicious silences. But together they suggest something Britain never quite wanted to write down. That royalty, for all its robes and ceremony, has never been immune to the private decay behind public myth.